Very considerate of you. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah.
Good morning.
Is that better? Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Penn State Center for Healthy Aging Community Lecture Series. That's a mouthful. We are so glad to see your faces. There are some folks here in person. We also have a live stream, and so I just wanted to make you aware of that, so that we have folks joining us online as well. My name is Amy Lorick, and I'm so pleased to see you today. I am here because I coordinate this event. I also wanted to make you aware there is an evaluation for this talk. We'd love to have your feedback after you hear it. I'd also like to thank our host, the Village at Penn State. Let's give them a warm applause for their lovely breakfast. And also for helping us promote this event. We have other partners who help spread the word as well, and we hope to see you at a future lecture in the community. We are also at Juniper Village and at Foxdale. Today we are at the Village of Penn State, and I am here to introduce our speaker, Dr. Martin Sliwinski. He is the director of our Center for Healthy Aging, and we always like to have him in the rotation of speakers because he is paying close attention to the changing science of healthy aging. And so, welcome, Marty. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome. It's always great to get applause at the beginning. Let's see what you do at the end. Well, good. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Because sometimes my wife says I don't have an indoor voice. I always have an outdoor voice, so I just want to make sure I'm not blasting you out of the room. Well, great. So before we begin today, I want to lay out some ground rules. First, I like to keep this interactive, so I may be asking you questions throughout. In fact, I'm going to start you off with a question for you to think about. And we can have some conversation throughout the lecture with the understanding that I may cut it a little bit short so we can get through the content and save some of the discussion for the end. The other thing that I would like to do is to introduce two very important people, Kat and Ashley in the back. Raise your hands. Right. So they're with Penn State. They're graduate students in psychology, and they're with PALS, which is our volunteer network for participating in research activity. So all of the content you hear during these lecture series comes from research. And research begins with people like yourselves who volunteer some of your time to participate. So if you find any of this valuable, check out to see what opportunities there are for research to participate in that. Well, great. So we'll go ahead and get started. But before we do, I'll go ahead and give you a little outline of what we're going to talk about. So we have three topics for today. First, and if I step away from here and then you can't hear me, just go ahead and wave me down and I'll come back because I like to move around a little bit. First, I'll give you some updates on recent trends in brain health. Are things looking up or are things looking down? Second, I'll talk about the importance of both education and the kind of work that we do during our work careers, our occupation, the importance of both of those features and how they interact for maintaining our brain health into older age. And I'll introduce a concept called cognitive reserve. I'll also talk about the dark side of that called cognitive debt. And then finally, we'll just conclude with some discussion of opportunities for how to build brain health throughout a person's life. So in particular, thinking about retirement. So here's your little mini assignment right now. If you were to be asked to give some advice to individuals, maybe my age or a little bit younger, say maybe Amy's age, about retirement, what advice would you give them of how to plan for retirement? And then we'll kind of check in with you, and then we'll talk about sort of what the science of healthy aging says about what's important and what's challenging for retirement with respect to brain health. Okay, so just to begin, I want the information that I present to you to be personally relevant, and hopefully the information I present will allow you to make positive changes in your life. But that said, anytime you hear any kind of lifestyle suggestions before you make any change to your diet, your physical activity, anything like that, always recommend you check with your doctor. Sorry, I'm a little bit behind here. This is why I like to look back here. The second thing is I always try to stick to the science and to the evidence when describing research and plans for healthy aging, but I will also share my opinion, and I'll try to be very clear as to whether or not the information I'm giving you is sort of the scientific consensus based on evidence, whether it's my interpretation of evidence, or whether it's just my opinion, good or bad on that. Okay, well, let's go ahead and begin and talk about recent trends in brain health, and are they looking good or bad? So, no pun intended, brain health is on people's minds. There is a recent study done by the University of Michigan involving thousands of people across the United States, and these are people ages 25 on up. Nearly half expressed some concern or worry about maintaining cognitive health and concern about losing their memory or dementia as they moved into older age. Okay. So for those of you who have been following the news, you may know that there have been some recent advances in the treatment of dementia and Alzheimer's disease that look somewhat promising and can potentially slow the progression of the disease. I'd be willing to talk a little bit about that if people have questions. Suffice to say, these are by no means miracle drugs or cures, and as of right now, there are still, let me go back. There you go. There are still no approved preventive treatment. So there's no drug or pill you can take that can prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease. But there is some good news. A recent, and I'm going to have to do this because I get a little confused with what I see on here. There was a recent study that was done looking at trends in the prevalence of dementia. So the prevalence is the percentage, if we were to take a snapshot of the United States, the percentage of people over a certain age who might be diagnosed with dementia. And over a 12-year period, I think this was spanning between 2000 and 2012, interestingly, the prevalence of dementia decreased relatively substantially, the relative decrease of about 24%. And this is with, taking into account the fact that during this time there's no treatment for this. So nonetheless, the prevalence of dementia decreased. There is an update recently published a couple years ago looking at over a 30-year period, nearly 30-year period, incident rates. And incidence refers to the number of new cases every year. Prevalence, total number, incidence, new cases. And the incidence rates for dementia are decreasing by about 13% every 10 years over the course of time. So this is really exciting, really interesting, but I just do want to point out that the total number of dementia cases in the United States and in fact in the world is increasing because people are living to longer ages, older ages. There are just more people around, so the total number of cases are increasing, but the percentage or the likelihood that any given individual develops dementia is happily decreasing. So, yes?
Is this just Alzheimer's, or is it also vascular dementia?
What a great question. The question was, is this pertaining to just Alzheimer's or does it also include other kinds of dementia like vascular dementia? And it is the latter. So this tends to be all types of dementia, and in fact there's probably a larger increase for vascular dementia, or larger decrease for vascular compared to Alzheimer's dementia. So being a researcher and a scientist, sort of hearing good news is not enough. So in the spirit of looking a gift horse in the mouth, right, we want to ask, why is it that dementia rates are decreasing? So to try and answer this, we look to the science that tells us what are some modifiable factors. So sort of the genetic contribution to Alzheimer's disease is relatively small. There's a subset of individuals for whom it is a very strong determinant, but this is a minuscule percentage of total cases. So researchers, epidemiologists, physicians, scientists are very interested in trying to identify modifiable risk factors for dementia. These are things that we can do or things that happen to us that we can change or society can change that affects the likelihood we can develop dementia. And this is could be a little mini pop quiz or exam, especially for those of you who've been to these previous lectures. Can anyone think of any of these modifiable lifestyle or environmental risk factors? Yes? Alcohol use. Importance of exercise, physical activity. Yep. Diet, nutrition.
So learning new things.
Learning new things and socializing.
Social network.
Social, great, excellent. So, smoking is a big one. So, yep. Sleep. What would you all like to get up here and you're hitting everything. Well, good. So when epidemiologists or scientists identify these factors, they've categorized them as to what part of the human lifespan they're most important or most salient. Not that they only apply there, but that's kind of where they mostly apply. So you have early life, midlife, and later life, and in early life education, educational attainment. So having less education is a risk factor for dementia. Having more education protects you against developing dementia. The 7% refers to the percent of total dementia cases that can be attributable to this particular factor. And then when we look at midlife, we see a host of different factors, some of which you've identified. So when people talk about diet, it's very, very important, but often that's manifest in conditions like obesity and hypertension. You want to protect your noggin. Traumatic brain injury is a risk factor. And what's important, and a little disappointing no one said this unless I didn't hear, hearing loss is one of the strongest predictors of developing dementia. The last lecture I gave here, I talked about some of the neurological mechanisms through which that can drive, but the bottom line is, especially in midlife, if you have hearing loss, get a hearing aid. If you get a hearing aid, you mitigate the entire risk of hearing loss for developing dementia. If you have questions about that, we can talk about it during the discussion period. And then in later life, of course, a lot of the ideas that all of you shared. Air pollution is something that I talked about last time, exposure in particular to fine particulate matter. Social isolation is a risk factor, staying socially connected, very important. Remember that for later in the lecture. And then, of course, smoking is important, and then mental health. Yes? Great question. So the percentages refer to population attributable fraction. So in plain English, that's the percent of total dementia cases that could be eliminated if we fixed that problem. So you look at hearing loss, 8% of dementia cases could be eliminated if we fixed the contribution of hearing. Right? Those are just to give you a rough gauge of sort of their relative importance. So what I haven't done in previous lectures, what I'm going to do today, is focus a little bit on early life and education, because this has relevance not just for what children do, but for what we do over the course of our entire life. So it was, not until about 20 years ago did researchers actually believe that what happens to us has any determination for Alzheimer's disease. So the role of education has become people are very, very interested in this. And recently there was a study that was published that describes the percentage of people with dementia, how those trends have changed over time from about the year 2000 to 2016, and how different levels of education impact. So what you can see from this graph, and on the y-axis, the up and down axis, that's the percentage of individuals with dementia. So the higher the lines, it means the higher the percentage of individuals in that group with dementia. The green lines refer to people with less than a high school education. They have the highest rates of dementia, and that persists over time. If you look at the other lines, like the yellow, blue, and red lines, the blue and red lines are people who completed college or more than college. And what you can see is there really is what they call a dose-response effect. The more education people receive, the less likelihood they develop dementia. Right? And this is important because the researchers analyzed data from a study called the Health and Retirement Study in the United States, tens of thousands of individuals over the years between 2000 and 2016. And during that time, college education rates for men increased from about 21 to 34% in this sample, and from 12 to about 23% for women. And the researchers were able to determine that about 40% of the reduction in dementia was attributable to increased educational attainment. This is very important to keep in mind, especially in contemporary discourse about the potential value of higher education. The value of higher education goes beyond simply the transaction of a dollar that's based in your salary. So let's ask you, why might education reduce dementia risk? Any thoughts on that? Yeah?
Use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it.
I think that actually it's because people that are better educated are more curious and stay active with their brains throughout life rather than the early education or not early education. So it's a lifelong learning process that more educated people are more interested in.
So I'm getting a little suspicious that people have looked ahead in the slides. Sort of the groundwork and foundation that sets up for individuals for lifelong learning, lifelong curiosity. Yep.
More a question. Has it been balanced for socioeconomic? Like you could say that higher educated people are coming from backgrounds that allow them to more easily attain that.
Yeah. So what a great question. A lot of these. So the question was, does this balance for family wealth, socioeconomic background? And the researchers try to do that with the available information. It is imperfect. It is imperfect. So yes, in a lot of respects, wealth leads to health. And we'll do one or two.
Better educated people are able to understand better the consequences of their actions and how they might be reducing their chances of getting dementia.
As an educator, I really appreciate that's a very optimistic view. If it were only that simple, but that is true. Yes?
I was going to say, you didn't make connection one subject area or one thought to another thought.
So if you can make connections, that is valuable. And we're going to come back to that same point, that synthetic thinking, and how that relates to the ways in which education and also the ways in which we work, our employment, affects our brain health. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to build cognitive reserve, right, and what cognitive reserve is. So, I think some of you probably have heard that term cognitive reserve before. What exactly does it mean? So cognitive reserve is a hypothesis that's relatively recent, over the last 20 years or so, and it refers to the, I didn't know if that was me, that's okay. And it refers to the mind's and the brain's resistance to damage to the brain, right? So this was first discovered and by the way, if anyone's interested in this, there's a wonderful book. It's by David Snowden, and it's about something called the Nun Study. So it was a study of Catholic nuns where they analyzed their writings and could determine, based on the complexity of their writings when they were 20, whether or not they would develop Alzheimer's disease and brain problems. But what this study and other studies, some of which I was involved in, found that certain individuals functioning absolutely fine up until the point where they passed away. And thankfully, many of these individuals donated their brains to science. So when autopsy was done, in some of these individuals, we looked and said, "Oh my gosh, they have Alzheimer's disease. They have plaques and tangles in the brain, but they had no symptoms. Couldn't tell." Okay. And the reason for that is because these individuals had high levels of what we now call cognitive reserve. So I'll try to describe briefly what this is. So cognitive reserve derives from having enriched, at least initially it was thought, enriched early experiences. So if you have good educational attainment, complexity in your environment, your brain can build backup connections, right? So think about a suspension bridge that maybe is just held by one line, right? If that one line snaps, what happens? The bridge falls. Now imagine a suspension bridge that has multiple lines holding it up. One can snap, but the bridge is still intact. So think about cognitive reserve as your brain just building lots of connections, lots of synapses, dendritic complexity in terms of the connections. So if you do develop Alzheimer's pathology and it begins to damage parts of your brain says, that's okay, I got plenty where that came from, right? So what's important is that maybe having a high level of education and building cognitive reserve does not prevent you from getting the disease. It just makes you resistant or robust or resilient to that. Right? Very, very important. Because that's also optimistic, because if you do have a genetic predisposition, that doesn't mean all hope is lost. It means there are things you can do, maybe not to prevent yourself from getting it, but to prevent it from having an effect. Okay. So now to the point of lifetime education and curiosity, we now know that cognitive reserve is not only built when you're a kid. We now know that neuroplasticity, the ability for your brain to grow and change, doesn't stop at age 18. Doesn't stop at age 20. Doesn't stop at age 30. Doesn't stop at age 40. It doesn't stop, period. So this idea that experiences later in life can affect brain health, function, and build neuroplasticity. So doing complex things, mentoring, being socially engaged, teaching, all of that can help build cognitive reserve into older age. And much in the same way that we understand disparities in educational attainment among different sets of individuals when they're young, can lead to long-term health disparities, and in particular, brain health inequities. Individuals from marginalized groups, from lower socioeconomic status, individuals who don't have those types of opportunities, there's a consequence later in life. Much in the same way, middle-aged adults who don't have an opportunity for mental stimulation, social engagement, and growth might also be at increased risk compared to those who have work environments and social environments that can facilitate this lifelong learning and curiosity. So let's talk a little bit about the notion of occupational complexity in brain health. So how many of you worked at some point? Okay. Right, so many of you, and I know there's some people who maybe were able to retire a little bit early. We'll talk about the effects of that. Most people work for 40 years, 8 hours a day. Add that up. Anyone do the math quick? Did anyone look ahead on the slides to see the answer? No. Okay. About 67,000 hours of your life will be spent at work. Okay. It is school for adults. Right? It is school for adults in the sense that you're going there during school hours, you're spending your time there. What do you get out of it? So there's this interesting study that showed actually what can happen in an extreme circumstance when you have a job that really challenges you mentally. Who here has been to London? Who here has been to London? And who's written in one of the cabs in London? Okay, so there is a study, the London Cabbie Study, right? So I had a chance to go to London for the first time a year ago, and I rode in one of these cabs, and it's really interesting. They don't use GPS, right? They have to pass a test that's called the knowledge, right? And what the knowledge is, they have to study all the streets of London. That's the map. That's their study guide. It's a little small. If you go up closer, it looks even worse, right? And I found out exactly what the test is. They're given two addresses, and they need to calculate the shortest route between any two addresses. So this takes a year or more to study, and not everyone passes. Being a cab driver in London is a pretty good job, right? It's highly skilled, and not everyone can do this. So some neuroscientists studied the people who wanted to be London cabbies. Some people passed, could learn this, other people didn't. At the beginning of the study period, They put them in a MRI scanner, which if you're interested in what they look like, you can sign up for one of the PAL studies and you can see what it's like, and measured their brain size. Then 4 years later, they measured the brain size of the individuals who passed the exam and the ones who failed. And the ones who passed the exam, their brains grew. And in particular, the part of the brain, the hippocampus, which is associated with spatial memory, became larger, more gray matter. This is a very powerful demonstration. And these were not 18-year-olds. These were people between the ages of, say, 20 and 40. Right? So these are people at the beginning of midlife demonstrating that your job can have a positive impact on your brain health. Now, how many of you were London cabbies? None of you, right? Okay. No. And this, you don't have to do anything quite that extreme to sort of have some benefit from employment, right? So when we think about occupational complexity and brain health, we can kind of think about it for typical people. So in a series of studies that were led by a former graduate student of mine, Jin-Shil Hun, as well as a few others, what she did is she used something called ONET, which is an occupational coding system, to identify in research studies, asking individuals, what jobs did you have when you were working, if they were older individuals, and then categorizing their jobs based on their complexity. And the way that this system works, I won't go into the specifics, but it's sort of complexity working with data, with people, and with things. And as it turned out, there were 3 or 4 dimensions of complexity that are going to be associated with good brain outcomes. So what does a high complexity occupation look like? It can be one that involves negotiating with people. Right? So you think of lawyers, right? Mentoring, right? So this could be any profession where you're a supervisor and involved in mentoring instruction. So teachers, certainly social workers apply as well. And then also coordinating and synthesizing data, right? Drawing, or who I forget who said synthesizing, sort of over here, yeah, drawing connections with data. So all of these are associated with jobs with high complexity. Nothing bad about a low complexity job, but is there something good, especially about jobs that are demanding like this? So there was a study that was recently published, and again, oh, by the way, we will make these slides available to everyone to download. So you can take photos, but you don't have to write things down. You can go check out the source material. You can't read the text there, but when you download the slides, you'd be able to sort of identify the study. Relatively consistent across different research studies, across different countries, across different segments of the population. People working in high complexity jobs have lower rates of dementia when they get into older age after they retire. This is a result that's relatively consistent across studies. There's also something special about this, that this effect, at least in a study that I was involved in the Bronx, seems to be strongest for Black Americans compared to white Americans. And the idea behind that is that individuals who maybe experienced sort of early deprivation in education can make up the difference in midlife if they're in a supportive and enriched environment. Very, very important. Was there?
What about those blue-collar jobs like mechanic, or in the building, or electrician, or a plumber? It could get busy.
Yeah.
It would be all.
Yeah, absolutely. So like plumbing, mechanics. So examples of jobs that didn't have low complexity. In the research article, I don't even know if there are any of these anymore, bookbinders. Right? So it's sort of like working on an assembly line where you're following instructions and doing something rote, things like that. And then there are degrees, right? So it's not like you only have the high and the low. Was there another question?
I just wanted to say, I am writing this down to tell my husband because he's an electrical contractor. And he does all of those things. You know, he negotiates with customers, he mentors the people that work for him, he instructs, and he coordinates and synthesizes.
Is he free next week? Because I'm looking for it. Okay. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. So so the blue collar, white collar classification isn't necessarily useful for this, and it's also not pay. It's not higher paying jobs are better cognitively or not. Right. So one other study that we did that's kind of important because it also helps you begin thinking about retirement. Right. So you're in school, you graduate, you stop going to school. You're working. Work is like school for adults. And then you retire and you stop working. What happens then? Okay. Well, here's the benefit. Let's just stick with sort of the glass is half full and the benefit of working in a high complexity job. You don't see it yet, do you? Okay. Now you do. You see a chart here, and what this tracks are changes in one particular measure of cognitive and mental function, beginning on the left side as the time of retirement, years post-retirement. The top line refers to the expected path that people with the highest job complexity follow. The lower line, the dotted line, people with the lowest job complexity. And what you should note, right, is that at the time of retirement, individuals with higher complexity jobs have better cognitive function, and they maintain that advantage over about 2 decades post-retirement. It's like saving for retirement, right? So complex jobs may help us, in addition to having good education, complex jobs, and it's not because they're jobs, it's the activities you're doing in the context of those jobs can maybe help us build cognitive reserve, and we're investing, in a sense, in our future. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is spend a little bit of just the last bit of the lecture talking about approaches to building brain health at any age, right? And what retirement should look like. So I figured, I am not yet retired, so I was going to get up here and say a few things, but I thought I would ask some of you. And maybe I'll take some notes here. So what advice would you give? Not sort of what did you do, because you may have made good choices, you may look back and say, I wish I had done something different. So kind of instead of that, what advice would you give to people in middle age for retirement? Yeah.
Make sure you have a niche once you retire. I often heard before I did, it's going to take you like 12 to 18 months to find your niche. But once you find it, it keeps you active like this.
Well, I'm literally preaching to the choir here. So. Excellent. Yeah.
I think one of the things is that retirement, instead of being like a date or a time, that it's a transition, that if you have parts of your job that you like and you can get rid of other parts and sort of phase down into retirement, I think can be very useful to them.
Excellent. So sort of like the whole phased retirement, being able to do that is a real privilege, and I know in academia we have opportunities to do that. That's wonderful. Yes?
Plan to do something that you really like afterwards. Don't just retire and sit on the porch. Something that keeps you involved.
One of the phrases that you used was lifelong learning. And in State College, we're very, very lucky to have Ollie. Mm-hmm. And anybody here who doesn't know about Ollie, it's fantastic.
And ours in particular is one of the best. Yeah. Yes? Don't retire. Okay. Now you're talking, at least according to some economists and some politicians. So what we're going to explore briefly is whether or not is it a public health good to increase the age of retirement? Okay. We'll talk about it, and I have some thoughts on that. But to answer the question, it's most important to identify what is it about work that's important. Is it earning the money? And then I'm talking about for your brain health. Or is it other parts of work? So when we're thinking about retirement, the new type of retirement planning, like thinking about you save, right? So you save for retirement, building cognitive reserve, so engaging in activities throughout your life, if you can, right, to kind of bolster your brain, but then also avoiding what's called cognitive debt. So I'm just throwing this piece in here because it pertains to a type of research that I'm particularly interested in, which is the role of stress and how stress can affect your brain and how it can create a type of cognitive debt and chip away at the reserves. So there is an interesting set of studies. We've done some of these looking at something called the cognitive debt hypothesis. And what this hypothesis states is that if you engage in a type of thinking, and we've all kind of done this, right? Sometimes we call it repetitive negative thinking. You get like a negative thought in your head, you can't let go, something stressed you out, you know, and your head hits the pillow at night and you're playing it over and over in your head, right? That when you do this, what that does is it prolongs your physiological states of stress. So if someone did something to you that made you annoyed earlier in the day, it got you physiologically aroused, you released cortisol, it stops, right? But then, if you start thinking about it again, it's almost like you're reliving that argument. Your body is doing it, right? So for those of you who are interested, here is a questionnaire that was used to measure an individual's proclivity to engage in repetitive negative thinking. So you can't read this, but if you download the slides, you can. I'll read some of them. How often do you have a thought? Do thoughts intrude into your mind? How often can't you not stop dwelling on your thoughts? Do your thoughts repeat yourself? Do thoughts just pop into your head? They administered this questionnaire to several hundred individuals. And then after doing that, they put them in a brain scanner, right? Oh, yes. Put them in a brain scanner. And what they found is that individuals who reported the highest levels of this type of mode of thinking had more levels of amyloid in the brain. Amyloid is a type of protein that's associated with Alzheimer's disease. And also more evidence of neurofibrillary tangles, higher levels of tau in the brain. More Alzheimer's pathology, but importantly also that they also experienced higher levels or more rapid decline. So that's a trajectory over a 4-year period in these individuals. The people who were the low ruminators, the people who didn't really ruminate, they're the top line. Hardly any change over 4 years in their memory function. The dotted line on the bottom are the people like me, like the big ruminators, and they declined in their memory function over time. Right? So the idea here is that cognitive debt can occur, and what kind of helps you prevent incurring this type of debt that can offset the reserves you build. Yes, in the back.
So which comes first? Which is the chicken and which is the egg? Do the proclivity for having the tau create the negative, the more?
That's a great question. So it's a chicken-egg question. Could it be that the changes in the brain related to Alzheimer's disease somehow interfere with your what psychologists call cognitive control, the ability to mentally control your thoughts, right? So your brain just becomes less efficient, so it runs wild. That's a fantastic question. We don't know. This is a relatively newer theory. It will be tested out by trying to have interventions that reduce this kind of negative thinking, and then looking in the future to see, does that actually improve brain health? Great question. So this question, is delaying retirement good or bad for your health? There's been a number of recent studies looking at the effects of retirement on health. Retirement is number 10 on the list of major life stressors. Right? So we're not going to talk about whether or not it's good socially to delay retirement. We're going to talk about what the challenges of retirement are, and you've already given some great advice. But yes?
Probably most of us here stayed in one or two jobs for an extended period of time, even more so than our parents did. And now from what I'm reading, a lot of the people coming up in the employment sector are not staying in jobs and don't plan to,
ongoing, that's going to have some effect of changing your statistics?
That's a great question. It's sort of the change in sort of the employment climate. Sort of, it could be called the gig economy, where you just go from one gig to the next. There's also a little bit less security, and also it's now the way in which you can move up and progress sometimes in certain professions. I don't know. The short answer, it could have either positive or negative effects, right? If it's always introducing novelty and you're always having to learn something new, that could potentially have a positive effect on brain health. But if it relates to insecurity, that then could lead to the negative side effects. Yeah?
Well, there's a certain sort of job institutionally, you know, what an emergency or what the government classifies as essential. The job runs along like that, like say a policeman or an air traffic control operator. There's a number of jobs like this. And if you get to retirement, at 4:59, you're fully functioning. At 5:01, the door closes and you can't even look back.
I know.
And the institution does that. Unless you're a professor in that field, it comes to a stop in 1 second.
Yeah.
And there's no looking back. Nobody knows you anymore because you're not part of that.
Well, on that note, yeah, I mean, and I think what you're pointing to are some critical elements of what sort of makes work good for you, right? And what can be a challenge with retirement. So without going into the specifics, there's been a bunch of new studies that have come out looking at cognitive decline in relation to retirement. And what is the case empirically, if you look at the data, the rate at which people decline cognitively tends to accelerate after retirement.
What is early retirement? What age?
So it's...
Be careful.
So this was done, I should know this, like the study on the left, I should know better. This was done in rural China, so I don't know what early retirement is a social norm. It is whatever is part of that social structure. So in France, retirement age currently is, I think, 62. They're arguing about whether it should go up to 64, 65. So early would be younger than that. Right?
The people in the study, were they from like here?
Well, so in this particular study, on the left one is from China. The study on the right is from people in Europe. But this has been replicated in studies in the United States. These are just example studies.
So from the United States, it would be
pre-65? Earlier than 65, okay. Yeah. Now, the question is why, right? And here's what now is emerging, a consensus from the research as to why people have trouble after retirement, and it relates to kind of finding your niche. So there's something now that's being called the silent challenge people face when they retire, something that isn't really talked about. People are so concerned about finances, so concerned about their bank accounts, that there isn't much discussion of what really ends up being the biggest challenge, which is often replacing the social connections that we develop during work. Right? So in a recent study that was just published, an 85-year-long study done by Harvard, it's only in white men pretty much, so it's I don't know how generalizable it is, but what they found is that retirees don't complain about missing the work. They complain about missing the people, right? The social aspect. So this is important because social isolation and loneliness can lead to stress, right? And that's one of the precursors to engaging in these negative modes of thought. So what retirement can do, if you don't plan for it correctly, it can give you a double whammy. You're no longer being exposed to cognitively and intellectually enriched environments, right? And maybe you're suffering from social deprivation because you no longer have those built-in social connections, right? So how do you maintain cognitive health into older age post-retirement? So the people who do the best during retirement are those who find ways to cultivate connections with each other, whether or not it's work for pay, whether or not it's for volunteer. So there's no secret recipe for success in retirement, but here is the way I think about this. I think that if you have opportunities, like hobbies may not be enough. Hobbies are great, but if you have opportunities to engage in leisure activity, I would prioritize those that maybe challenge you intellectually, but then also that foster social fitness. So reading books is great. Discussing them in a book club is potentially even better, right, because of that social piece. So, what did we talk about today? 3 take-home points. The first is just really emphasizing the value of higher education. Tremendous value, not just economically for individuals who are earning money, not just for the society right now in terms of contributing to the economy, but investing in the future, not just of ourselves, but of our society by reducing the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease and reducing all those associated costs. Education is valuable. The second important point is that we can build cognitive reserve throughout our entire life, lifelong learning, a lifelong curiosity. Work and occupation is one way to do it, it's not the only way. Right? The paycheck is not what makes your brain healthy. What makes your brain healthy is the activities you're doing while you're at work. And then just one final point. For people who are retired, pay attention to your social fitness for a successful retirement, not just for staying cognitively engaged by reading books or playing Wordle. Wordle's fine. So there's something called Octawordle, which is, oh yeah, it's 4 of them, right? So anyway, there's a level of frustration to that, but that's still pretty fun. But don't neglect the social aspect of your lives. So this is pretty much what I wanted to cover. This was great discussion. I'm glad we recorded this because I'm actually going to use this as a lecture for the course I'm teaching for undergraduates, mainly because of the great suggestions and contributions and ideas that all of you shared. So with that, I'd just like to thank you for your time and attention, and we have some time for conversation. Yes?
Just a very general question, which I actually wanted to ask you the last time you were
Oh, okay.
When I was growing up, I mean, we didn't have Alzheimer's wasn't discovered. We didn't have the term dementia. It was all senile and senile. Grandma senile. Is that term totally gone now? Has been replaced, or is it just no longer?
So the question is the term sort of senility replaced? Yes, in sort of scientific and medical discourse. There is a term called senescence, which is from the same root as senility, and that's what we refer to what happens to the cells in our body, something called cellular senescence, when they lose their capability for reproducing. So it now has a very technical meaning, but it doesn't have the same kind of pejorative flavor that you're describing. Yes?
With the increased number of people not going to the office and not socializing, working from home, how do you think that will affect the long-term outlook for those folks getting cognitive decline? So
this is a great question. And the question was, given with the changes to structure of work as a result of the pandemic, where there's more work remotely, less going into the office, what's the effect going to be? I don't know. I can speak from my own personal experience that I'm an extrovert, so I found it, the first 6 months was fine, but then I found it very challenging, and I felt something changing up there. So I think if there's a way to replace those social connections and you don't depend on those, maybe not much, but I think there is a potential hazard for people disconnecting, whether it's at work or through other means. That's a great question. Yes?
I would just say volunteering, not just the volunteering itself, but that social connection is very strong.
Yeah.
To make you feel so
And the other point, and maybe the next time I give a lecture, I'll talk about one of the most important psychological states that people can maintain into older age that is related to healthy longevity and brain health, and that's maintaining your sense of purpose, right? And how important that is. There is one thing there, and then you, go ahead.
Do supplements for memory loss work?
No. well, yes. In fact, there was a class action suit against Prevagen, which was settled. Now, this doesn't mean that nutrients aren't valuable. So, vitamin D, fish oil, all of those can have beneficial effects. I think where I would be suspicious is a nutraceutical that says this will make you younger and keep your brain healthy. That those claims are not regulated if it's a nutritional aspect, right? Okay, and yeah.
Are experts wondering about the effects of COVID on the young children and their lack of opportunity to build brain plasticity from 2 years outside of classroom?
Yeah, it remains to be seen. My suspicion is that whatever deficit that has caused is absolutely remediable just because of how plastic younger brains are. Yeah, I think that's good news. Yes. Yeah. And then, yeah.
Thank you. This is so interesting. Is there any research that's being done?
Sorry.
Is there any research that's being done on brain health and screen use?
And screen use. Okay. So the question is there any research being done on brain health and screen use? And I assume you don't mean the screens that keep the mosquitoes out. No. Okay. So yeah, I mean, and using computer screens, particularly mobile devices, and it's sort of the extent and the frequency with which people are on this it's changing the way the brain is working. It doesn't mean it's making it worse. Did you know that when printed material first came about, there was a huge backlash from the older people in the community about reading? They referred to it as reading fever, reading mania. The fact that young people are reading books all the time is going to destroy the world and society, right? And access to the printed page changed the way our brains work. This is changing the way our brains work. Is it going to be good or bad? All I can say is it's going to be different. Yes?
One other, it's sort of a segue off the Prevagen comment, but I saw a study recently, and it was, in the paper, so I didn't do a deep dive there. But it was basically on something called the MIND diet, which is an offshoot of the Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
With a little more emphasis on it. It was a very small study from what I recall, like 600 people, but they did brain dissections after so many years of what was your diet kind of thing. And they found that this MIND diet had significant, I forget if it's the A word in the brain or the
amyloid or
tangles, one of those two was significantly different. And obviously you can't cover everything in one lecture, but is there anything to say about diet?
Yeah, so I actually in a previous lecture talked a little bit about the MIND diet, and there's a checklist for this. You can go to the Mayo Clinic and check your diet against something called the MIND diet, which is a Mediterranean intervention for neurodegeneration. That's stands a mouthful for mind. The data are promising. The intervention studies where we help people eat a better diet are less conclusive, and we're trying to figure out why. And it could be adherence, it could be the amount of time you need to be on it, but that's research I would pay attention to and give some credence to. Yes?
And when you talk about the repetitive negative thinking, can meditation offset that process?
Yeah, a lot of things can. So meditation, cognitive behavioral therapy, going for a walk in the park, exercising, a lot of different interventions can disrupt those negative modes of thought. What works best for you might depend on your specific situation. But yeah, mindfulness meditation is an intervention that's designed to try and help individuals get out of those negative modes of thinking. Well, this has been great. I think we'll go ahead and wrap up the formal discussion here. You've been very patient and best class I've ever had, I think.
I didn't say that too long.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.